When I married Richard, I took his last name and used my middle name, becoming Elena Martinez in my personal life, while maintaining my identity as Sophia Blackwood for business purposes. The board members were exchanging stunned glances, trying to process this revelation. Vanessa had shrunk into her chair, suddenly understanding that she had been sleeping with the husband of the woman who owned the company. "That's not possible," Richard said, shaking his head. "I would have known, would you?" I asked quietly. "You never questioned why I had a surprising insight into Axion's operations. You never wondered how I could afford our lifestyle on a venture capitalist's salary. You never connected the dots because you didn't want to see them, Richard. You were too focused on climbing higher, on reaching the top. I've been married to you for 12 years, Richard said, his voice rising with incredulity. I think I'd know if my wife was secretly a billionaire, and yet you didn't. I replied simply. Because you never really saw me, Richard. You saw what you wanted to see: a supportive wife who could advance your career, then a replaceable executive when someone more advantageous came along. I turned to address the board directly. I inherited Axion, then Blackwood Technologies, from my father when I was 26. At his insistence, I maintained a separate public identity to protect myself and to observe the company's operations without the distortion that comes with power. It was an arrangement that served its purpose for many years. Director Peterson was the first to recover from the shock. So you've been, what? Spying on your own company? I've been learning, I corrected. Seeing Axion from every angle as its owner, and more recently, as one of its executives. It's given me unique insight that I intend to apply more directly moving forward. Richard's shock was evolving into fury. This entire time, you've been lying to me, making a fool of me. That wasn't my intention, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I kept my identities separate because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my fortune or position. I planned to tell you when the time was right, but it seems I waited too long enough for you to decide I was disposable. There was something almost satisfying about watching Richard process the implications, realizing that the wife he'd been preparing to discard was actually the owner of the company he'd been claiming, that the woman he'd been deceiving held his entire career in her hands. So what now? He demanded, a dangerous edge to his voice. You expose our private matters to the board out of spite. Is that your idea of professional leadership? This isn't about spite, I replied evenly. This is about accountability. You misused company resources to conduct an affair. You attempted to replace a high-performing executive for personal reasons. You compromised the Westridge acquisition process by allowing personal relationships to influence business decisions. These are matters the board should be aware of. I turned back to the stunned faces around the table. I'll be taking a more active role in operations moving forward, starting with a full audit of the executive team's expenses and hiring decisions. You can't do this, Richard hissed, desperation creeping into his voice. Actually, I can. And I am. I glanced at Vanessa, who was staring at Richard with growing horror. Miss Hughes, I suggest you update your resume. Your services won't be needed here. I nodded to the security personnel who had been waiting discreetly by the door. A precaution I'd arranged earlier that morning. Security will escort both of you to your offices to collect your personal belongings. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Richard's face had gone from pale to crimson. You're firing me. After 12 years of marriage, you're not even giving me a chance to explain. You had your chance to explain, I said quietly. Last night, when I confronted you about the affair, you chose calculation over honesty, Richard. You chose ambition over our marriage. As security approached, Richard looked around the room desperately, seeking allies among the executives and board members he'd cultivated for years. But they avoided his gaze, already recalibrating their allegiances, now that they understood who truly held power. "This isn't over," Richard said, his voice low and threatening as security escorted him and Vanessa toward the door. "Actually, it is," I replied, returning to my seat at the head of the table. I crafted some for Elena Martinez that highlighted my early career experience and venture capital background, while carefully avoiding any direct connection to the Blackwood name or fortune. I prepared as thoroughly as any job candidate, researching Axion's marketing history and developing a vision for the department, essentially critiquing and planning improvements for my own company. To minimize risk of recognition, I scheduled the interviews during a period when I had no Sapphire Blackwood appearances planned. I adopted a slightly different appearance for Elena, wearing glasses I didn't need, styling my hair differently, and using makeup techniques to subtly alter my features. Not a disguise, exactly, but enough changes that someone who had briefly met Sapphire Blackwood at a board meeting might not connect her to Elena Martinez. The precautions proved unnecessary. No one on the interview panel had spent enough time with Sapphire Blackwood to recognize her slightly altered doppelganger. The board members and executives knew the reclusive majority shareholder only through video calls, quarterly meetings, and the occasional public appearance, all carefully managed to maintain my privacy. I sailed through the interviews presenting a marketing strategy that I knew would work because I had access to proprietary data and projections that other candidates couldn't possibly obtain. It wasn't entirely fair, but I rationalized that I would excel in the role regardless. 2 weeks later, Richard brought home a bottle of champagne to celebrate Elena Martinez had been offered the position of Chief Marketing Officer at Axion Technologies. My first day as an Axion executive was disorienting. I'd visited the headquarters many times as Sapphire Blackwood, always treated with the deference due to the owner, always slightly removed from the day-to-day operations. Walking through the same lobby as Elena Martinez, just another executive with a security badge and a company laptop, was a strange exercise in perspective. My Elena office was on the executive floor, a glass-walled space with views of the Bay Bridge. Richard's office was at the opposite end of the same floor, which he assured me was coincidental rather than arranged. I spent that first morning meeting my direct reports, all of whom were politely welcoming but clearly reserving judgment on the SVP's wife who had landed a C-suite position. By the end of my first month, I had won over most of the skeptics through a combination of genuine marketing expertise and the advantages of my hidden knowledge. I understood Axion's true financial position, strategic goals, and market challenges better than anyone except perhaps the CEO. I knew which products were planned for sunset and which were being positioned for growth. I could align my marketing strategies perfectly with the company's actual direction, not just its stated one. Richard and I fell into new rhythms, commuting together most days, occasionally meeting for lunch in the company CAF, sometimes sharing knowing glances during particularly tedious executive meetings. For the first time, I was seeing my husband in his professional environment, observing how he interacted with subordinates, peers, and superiors. I was impressed by his strategic thinking and leadership style, though occasionally surprised by a harder edge that emerged in high-pressure situations, a calculating coldness I'd never seen at home. For nearly a year, the arrangement worked better than I had dared hope. The marketing department thrived under my leadership, with campaign metrics improving across all channels. Richard and I were spending more time together than we had in years, sharing the satisfactions and frustrations of our workdays. I began to think that my risky gambit might actually succeed, that I could maintain this double life until the perfect moment for revelation arrived. Then came the Westridge acquisition. Westridge Technologies was a mid-sized competitor that had developed an innovative AI platform that would complement Axion's existing products. As Sophia Blackwood, I had already identified it as an acquisition target and had my financial team begin quietly purchasing shares. As Elena Martinez, I was now part of the executive team evaluating the potential marketing synergies of a merger. The acquisition process was intense, requiring late nights and weekend work from the entire executive team. Richard became increasingly focused, cancelling our personal plans and staying at the office well after I'd gone home. At first, I thought nothing of it. Major acquisitions are all-consuming, and Richard's role in evaluating the strategic fit was central to the deal. But as weeks passed, I began to notice patterns. Richard was missing from meetings where he should have been present. His calendar, which I had access to as a fellow executive, showed blocks of time marked only as external meeting with no details. He was coming home later and later, sometimes well after midnight, offering only vague explanations about hammering out details and alignment sessions. The first solid evidence came through Elena's channels. The marketing team was preparing integration materials, pending the acquisition announcement, and I had asked for access to the secure server where deal documents were stored. Among the organization charts and transition plans, I found a revised executive structure for post-acquisition. My position, the CMO role, had been marked for transition, with a note indicating potential acquisition talent to be evaluated for fit. That same night, Richard's phone buzzed with a text while he was in the shower. I had never been the type to snoop, but something, intuition or subconscious awareness of subtle changes, prompted me to glance at the screen. Still on for tomorrow. Same place at 7? When Richard emerged from the bathroom, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, pretending to review budget spreadsheets on my laptop. I tried to dismiss my suspicions. Could be anyone. The meeting could be legitimate. I was overreacting to standard acquisition reshuffling plans. But over the next 2 weeks, I began to document discrepancies. Richard's expense reports, which I accessed through Elena's executive portal, showed dinners at restaurants we'd never visited together, always for 2 people, always coded to Westridge. Acquisition discussions. There were Uber receipts from our home address late at night, heading downtown to the St. Regis Hotel, and return trips in the early morning. Charges from jewelry stores appeared on our shared credit card statement. Purchases I had never received. As Sophia, I could have ordered a full investigation. As Elena, I had to pretend ignorance while gathering evidence piece by painful piece. The final confirmation came during a senior leadership meeting to finalize the acquisition announcement. Richard was presenting the strategic integration plan when a slide appeared with the new organizational structure. We've identified several areas of redundancy that will be addressed during integration, he explained smoothly. Most notably in marketing, where Westridge brings significant digital expertise that complements our traditional strengths. On the screen, the marketing department showed a new name in the CMO box. Vanessa Hughes, currently Westridge's VP of Digital Marketing. I maintained my composure through what felt like superhuman effort. asking appropriately professional questions about transition timing and team structure. No one in the room seemed to find it unusual that Richard was calmly discussing replacing his own wife's position, evidence that our careful separation of personal and professional had been effective, perhaps too effective. After the meeting, I pulled Richard aside in a conference room. "Were you planning to discuss the marketing leadership transition with me before presenting it to the entire executive team?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was waiting for the right moment. "This acquisition is delicate, Elena. The board wants Westridge's digital-first approach throughout the organization. And you don't think I'm capable of implementing that approach? My last campaign increased digital engagement by 64. It's not about capability," Richard said, his tone shifting to something patronizing that made my blood boil. "It's about optics. The board and investors need to see fresh thinking from the Westridge team integrated throughout Axion. Vanessa brings exactly the high-profile digital native perspective they're looking for." "Vanessa, VAC," I said, working to keep my expression neutral. "And when were you planning to tell me that you've been meeting with my replacement privately for weeks?" Richard's expression flickered surprise, quickly masked by defensive anger. "I've been meeting with dozens of Westridge executives. It's my job to evaluate the talent we're acquiring at the St. Regis. Until AM." His eyes narrowed. "You've been checking up on me." "I noticed the expense reports," I said, which was true enough. "I noticed a lot of things, Richard." We stared at each other, years of secrets and now lies stretching between us. Finally, Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't the place to discuss this," he said. "We'll talk at home." But we didn't talk at home. Richard texted that he had to work late again. I spent the evening accessing every system I could as Elena, downloading emails, calendar entries, expense reports, and hotel receipts. I compiled a comprehensive dossier of Richard's meetings with Vanessa Hughes over the past 3 months, correlating them with his absences and excuses. At the same time as Sophia Blackwood, I began making preparations. I contacted my private legal team, not Axion's corporate counsel, and had them prepare documents transferring my proxy voting rights back to my direct control. I instructed my financial advisors to halt the Westridge acquisition process pending my review. I scheduled an in-person appearance at the upcoming board meeting, the first time in over a year that Sophia Blackwood would physically enter Axion headquarters. When Richard finally came home after midnight, I was sitting in the dark living room, a single lamp illuminating the stack of papers on the coffee table. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the rage and grief churning inside me. Richard froze in the doorway, then slowly set down his briefcase. "Elena, whatever you think is happening, I know exactly what's happening," I interrupted. "You're having an affair with Vanessa Hughes while planning to replace me at Axion. What I don't know is why you thought you needed to lie about it. If you wanted a divorce, you could have just asked." Richard's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, guilt, calculation, and finally a cold determination I'd glimpsed in business settings, but never directed at me. "It's not that simple," he said, loosening his tie as he sat across from me. "The situation is complicated. Enlighten me," I replied, folding my arms. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Axion is changing. The Westridge acquisition is just the beginning. Bradley is retiring within the year, and the board is looking for a certain type of leader to take his place, and that type is you," I said flatly. "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. But to secure that position, I need to demonstrate complete alignment with the board's vision. That means embracing Westridge's culture and leadership. And Vanessa Hughes is part of that package. I filled in. Professionally and personally. Richard didn't deny it. Vanessa's father is on Axion's board. Her connections to major tech investors are extensive. Our relationship, he paused, searching for words. It evolved organically through the acquisition process. I didn't plan it. How convenient, I said, every word coated in ice. And my role in all this. I think we need some time apart, Richard said, not quite meeting my eyes. The board has concerns about your recent performance metrics. Taking a leave of absence would be the most dignified approach. My performance metrics? I repeated incredulously. My department has outperformed every target for the past 3 quarters. It's not just about numbers, Elena. Sometimes companies need fresh perspectives. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. The calculated cruelty of it all, replacing me professionally to make room for his mistress, fabricating performance issues to justify it, presenting it as a fait accompli, revealed a person I didn't recognize. Get out, I said quietly. Richard blinked. This is my house too. Not tonight, it isn't. Pack a bag, Richard. I need time to process this perspective. To my surprise, he didn't argue further. Perhaps he'd been planning his exit already, or perhaps he simply recognized the danger in pushing me further in that moment. Either way, he went upstairs, packed a suitcase, and left without another word. I sat in the silent house until dawn, making the hardest decision of my life. I could fight for my marriage, try to understand how we'd reached this point, perhaps even forgive the betrayal. Or I could finally stop living a divided life and reclaim my power, all of it. By sunrise, my mind was clear. I made 2 phone calls, one as Elena to Axion's HR department requesting a personal day, and one as Sophia to my legal team, instructing them to prepare for my full return to Axion leadership. The board meeting was scheduled for 4 a.m. For the first time in 12 years, I would walk into that room as my complete self. No more compartmentalization, no more hiding. Richard had made his choice, and now I would make mine. I showered, dressed in a tailored navy suit I'd never worn as Elena, and took extra care with my appearance. Today, I would not be Richard Martinez's soon-to-be ex-wife, or the CMO on her way out. Today, I would be Sophia Blackwood, owner of Axion Technologies, facing the husband who had no idea who he'd really married or who he'd decided to betray. The Axion headquarters lobby was bustling with the usual morning activity when I arrived. I bypassed the security desk where I would normally check in as Elena Martinez, instead approaching the executive elevator that required special access. The security guard stationed there straightened as I approached. Miss Blackwood, he said with a nod of recognition, though I knew he'd only seen me a handful of times in person. We weren't informed you'd be visiting today. It was a last-minute decision, I replied, offering my rarely used Sophia Blackwood access card. I'm here for the board meeting, of course, ma'am. Right this way. The executive floor was quiet when I stepped off the elevator. Most of the senior leadership already gathered in the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see them assembling, board members taking their usual seats, executives including Richard standing near the refreshment table, conversing in small groups. And there she was, Vanessa Hughes, sleek blonde hair falling past her shoulders, wearing a red dress that perfectly matched the Louboutin heels I'd seen on our credit card statement. I paused in the hallway, watching Richard lean close to say something in her ear that made her smile. The casual intimacy of the gesture made my stomach clench. For a moment, I considered walking away, returning to the shadows of my sapphire identity, divorcing Richard quietly as Elena, preserving the separate lives I'd maintained for so long. Instead, I straightened my spine, raised my chin, and pushed open the boardroom door. The chairman spotted me first, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Blackwood, we weren't expecting you today." The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me. Richard's expression shifted from professional blandness to shock as he registered my presence, his gaze darting between me and the door, as if expecting Elena Martinez to walk in behind me. I decided it was time to take a more active interest in recent developments, I said smoothly, moving to the empty chair at the head of the table, my chair, though I rarely occupied it in person. Particularly the Westridge acquisition and related personnel changes. Richard recovered quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Miss Blackwood, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his voice giving no indication of our personal connection. If he was concerned about my presence, he hid it well. "I wouldn't miss this particular meeting," I replied, my eyes locked with his. As I took my seat, I noted Vanessa's questioning glance at Richard, clearly wondering who I was and why my arrival had caused such a stir. She had no idea she was looking at her lover's wife, the woman she was replacing both professionally and personally. The chairman cleared his throat. "Well, this is certainly fortunate timing. We have several significant matters to discuss today, including the Westridge acquisition and some executive team restructuring." "Yes," I said, opening my portfolio. "I'm particularly interested in the changes to the marketing department leadership." Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. How much did I know as Sophia Blackwood? Had Elena told me something? Was this coincidence or interference? The meeting progressed with updates on quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives. Richard delivered a polished presentation on the Westridge acquisition benefits, carefully avoiding any direct mention of the executive reshuffling. As he concluded, I decided it was time to force the issue. "Thank you for that comprehensive overview, Mr. Martinez," I said formally. "Now, I understand there are some personnel announcements planned for today. Perhaps we should address those next." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, as part of the Westridge integration, we've identified several opportunities to bring in their top talent in key positions." He clicked to the next slide, showing the organizational chart with Vanessa's name in the CMO box. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Vanessa Hughes," Richard announced with practiced confidence. "She'll be taking over as our new Chief Marketing Officer following Elena's departure." The way he said departure made my blood simmer, as if the woman he'd married, the woman he'd shared a bed with just days ago, was merely an inconvenient footnote in his corporate ascension. Vanessa smiled broadly, flipping her blonde hair as she stood to acknowledge the introduction. "I'm thrilled to be joining the Axion family," she said, her voice polished and confident. "I've long admired the company's market position, and I see tremendous opportunities to build on Elena Martinez's foundation with more aggressive digital strategies." I watched the board members nod approvingly. None of them looked at me, Sophia Blackwood, with any concern about this restructuring. Why would they? As far as they knew, I was merely a major shareholder who rarely involved herself in personnel decisions. The invisible owner who rubber-stamped their recommendations through proxies and representatives. "That's an interesting decision," I said. causing heads to snap in my direction. My voice was measured, but it carried authority that immediately silenced the room, especially considering the marketing department's exceptional performance under its current leadership. Richard's smile remained fixed, but I could see tension building in his jaw. Elena has done adequate work, he said carefully, but Miss Hughes brings fresh expertise from her time at Westridge Media. Westridge Media, I repeated thoughtfully. The same company that lost 3 major accounts last quarter due to ineffective campaign management. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. Those accounts were already problematic when I inherited them. Perhaps, I conceded. But I'm curious, Mr. Martinez, what metrics are you using to determine that your current CMO needs replacement? Because the data I'm looking at shows a 43% increase in conversion rates and a 27% reduction in customer acquisition costs in the past year alone. The board chairman cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Blackwood raises a valid point, Richard. The marketing results have been quite impressive. Richard's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. With all due respect, Miss Blackwood, you're not involved in day-to-day operations. There are intangible factors at play. Intangible factors, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet, the tension palpable as board members and executives exchanged uneasy glances. A few of them were beginning to sense that something unusual was unfolding. I opened my portfolio and removed a stack of documents, passing them around the table. This is Elena Martinez's performance review from last month, showing exemplary results across all measured categories. As the board members examined the documents, I extracted another set of papers from my portfolio. And this, I continued, distributing the second stack, is a compilation of evidence showing Mr. Martinez's inappropriate relationship with Miss Hughes, including hotel receipts, text message logs, and gift purchases using company funds. The air seemed to vacate the room as the board members began reviewing the evidence. Richard's face had drained of color, while Vanessa looked as though she might be sick. Director Peterson, the most senior board member, removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. "This is a personal matter," Richard said through gritted teeth, finding his voice at last. "It has no bearing on executive decisions. Not when company resources are being misappropriated," I countered. "And not when qualified employees are being terminated to make room for romantic partners." Vanessa's cheeks flushed crimson. "I was hired based on my qualifications," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Were you?" I asked, turning my attention to her. "Were you aware that Mr. Martinez fabricated performance issues to justify removing his wife from her position? Or that he used company funds to purchase the Tiffany bracelet you're wearing?" Vanessa's hand instinctively moved to cover the silver bracelet on her wrist. Her eyes darted to Richard, who stood rigid, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "This is inappropriate, Miss Blackwood," Richard said, struggling to maintain composure. "Whatever personal grievance Elena has shared with you, Elena hasn't shared anything with me," I interrupted, rising to my feet. It was time. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly across from Richard. The confusion on his face was almost comical. He genuinely had no idea what was happening, why his carefully constructed plan was unraveling. "But there's something else you should know," I continued, my voice clear and steady despite the thundering of my heart. "Elena Martinez isn't just your wife and your company's exemplary CMO. Elena Martinez is me." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at me, incomprehension slowly giving way to disbelief. What are you talking about? He finally managed. I was born Sophia Elena Blackwood, I explained, addressing the entire room but keeping my eyes fixed on Richard. When I married Richard, I took his last name and used my middle name, becoming Elena Martinez in my personal life, while maintaining my identity as Sophia Blackwood for business purposes. The board members were exchanging stunned glances, trying to process this revelation. Vanessa had shrunk into her chair, suddenly understanding that she had been sleeping with the husband of the woman who owned the company. That's not possible, Richard said, shaking his head. I would have known, would you? I asked quietly. You never questioned why I had a surprising insight into Axion's operations. You never wondered how I could afford our lifestyle on a venture capitalist's salary. You never connected the dots because you didn't want to see them, Richard. You were too focused on climbing higher, on reaching the top. I've been married to you for 12 years, Richard said, his voice rising with incredulity. I think I'd know if my wife was secretly a billionaire, and yet you didn't, I replied simply. Because you never really saw me, Richard. You saw what you wanted to see: a supportive wife who could advance your career, then a replaceable executive when someone more advantageous came along. I turned to address the board directly. I inherited Axion, then Blackwood Technologies, from my father when I was 26. At his insistence, I maintained a separate public identity to protect myself and to observe the company's operations without the distortion that comes with power. It was an arrangement that served its purpose for many years. Director Peterson was the first to recover from the shock. So you've been, what? Spying on your own company? I've been learning, I corrected. Seeing Axion from every angle as its owner, and more recently, as one of its executives. It's given me unique insight that I intend to apply more directly moving forward. Richard's shock was evolving into fury. This entire time you've been lying to me, making a fool of me. That wasn't my intention, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I kept my identity separate because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my fortune or position. I planned to tell you when the time was right, but it seems I waited too long enough for you to decide I was disposable. There was something almost satisfying about watching Richard process the implications, realizing that the wife he'd been preparing to discard was actually the owner of the company he'd been claiming, that the woman he'd been deceiving held his entire career in her hands. So what now? He demanded, a dangerous edge to his voice. You expose our private matters to the board out of spite. Is that your idea of professional leadership? This isn't about spite, I replied evenly. This is about accountability. You misused company resources to conduct an affair. You attempted to replace a high-performing executive for personal reasons. You compromised the Westridge acquisition process by allowing personal relationships to influence business decisions. These are matters the board should be aware of. I turned back to the stunned faces around the table. I'll be taking a more active role in operations moving forward, starting with a full audit of the executive team's expenses and hiring decisions. You can't do this, Richard hissed, desperation creeping into his voice. Actually, I can, and I am. I glanced at Vanessa, who was staring at Richard with growing horror. Miss Hughes, I suggest you update your resume. Your services won't be needed here. I nodded to the security personnel who had been waiting discreetly by the door. A precaution I'd arranged earlier that morning. Security will escort both of you to your offices to collect your personal belongings. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Richard's face had gone from pale to crimson. You're firing me. After 12 years of marriage, you're not even giving me a chance to explain. You had your chance to explain, I said quietly. Last night, when I confronted you about the affair. You chose calculation over honesty, Richard. You chose ambition over our marriage. As security approached, Richard looked around the room desperately, seeking allies among the executives and board members he'd cultivated for years. But they avoided his gaze, already recalibrating their allegiances, now that they understood who truly held power. This isn't over, Richard said, his voice low and threatening as security escorted him and Vanessa toward the door. Actually, it is, I replied, returning to my seat at the head of the table. Were we both without fault, Sophia? Or Elena, whoever you really are? You lied to me for 12 years about your identity. You deceived me about the very foundation of our relationship. I didn't sleep with someone else, I pointed out. No. You just pretended to be someone you weren't for our entire marriage, he shot back. Do you have any idea what it felt like to discover that my wife, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, was essentially a fiction? That you were manipulating me from the start. That wasn't my intention, I said quietly. Wasn't it? Richard leaned forward. You married me knowing I worked for your company. You watched me struggle and strive, all while you could have snapped your fingers and given me what I wanted. You played God with my career, Sophia. His words landed with uncomfortable force. I had never seen my actions in that light, had always viewed my deception as protection, not manipulation. But from his perspective, I kept our world separate, because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I owned, I said. Richard laughed without humor. How convenient that your quest for authentic love required elaborate deception. Tell me, what was your plan? To reveal yourself once I'd proven worthy? To surprise me with the truth once I'd passed whatever test you'd designed? I had no ready answer. My justification suddenly seemed hollow even to my own ears. I'll agree to your terms, I said after a long moment. The prenup settlement, a neutral recommendation letter, and mutual non-disparagement. I'll have Myra draw up the papers. Richard nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Thank you. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Was any of it real? Did you ever actually love me? Or was I just an interesting experiment in living like a normal person? The question cracked something open inside me, a reservoir of grief I'd been holding at bay with righteous anger. I loved you, I said softly. That part was real. It's why this hurts so much. Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or just resignation. He nodded once, and then left without another word. The divorce was finalized with remarkable speed once we'd agreed to terms. Richard relocated to Chicago, returning to his roots with a position at a mid-sized tech firm facilitated, no doubt, by the neutral recommendation I had provided. Vanessa Hughes disappeared from the Silicon Valley scene entirely. I heard through industry channels that she had moved to Portland and shifted to nonprofit work about as far from the corporate tech world as one could get while still using her marketing skills. The Westridge acquisition ultimately proceeded, though with significantly revised terms after our legal review uncovered several concerning clauses that had been inserted during Richard's negotiations. The integration was challenging but ultimately successful, strengthening Axion's market position and expanding our technological capabilities. As for me, I continued as both CEO and owner of Axion, no longer hiding behind proxies or alternate identities. The board adjusted to the new reality, with the pragmatism typical of corporate entities, whatever shock or resentment they might have felt about my deception was quickly subsumed by the opportunities presented by having an engaged, hands-on owner. The story of Richard's affair and my dual identity inevitably leaked to the business press, causing a brief flurry of sensationalist headlines. Tech heiress's secret double life exposed by cheating husband, screamed the San Francisco Chronicle. Billionaire CEO fired husband for affair with colleague, declared the Wall Street Journal with slightly more restraint. I declined all interviews and issued only a brief statement. Axion Technologies is focused on innovation and growth. My personal life is private, and I ask that the media respect that privacy as we move forward. The public's attention eventually shifted to newer scandals, though my reputation had fundamentally changed. No longer the reclusive heiress or the mysteriously absent owner, I was now known for the dramatic way I'd reclaimed my power. Some portrayed me as a calculating manipulator who had deceived her husband and company for years. Others cast me as a feminist hero who had exposed her cheating husband in the most spectacular way possible. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative. 6 months after the divorce, I sold the Pacific Heights house, unable to find comfort in rooms that held too many memories. I purchased a modern apartment in Russian Hill with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, a space with no history, where I could begin creating something new. On a crisp Saturday morning, as I was unpacking the last of my books, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Chicago number. "Hello," I answered cautiously. "Sophia," Richard's voice came through, surprising me. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "No, it's fine," I said, setting down the book I'd been holding ironically, a novel about identity and deception that Richard had given me years ago. "What can I do for you?" "Nothing, actually," he replied. "I'm calling because I owe you an apology." I sat down slowly on my new couch. "I'm listening. I've been doing a lot of therapy," Richard said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Turns out I have some issues with ambition and validation." Who knew? Despite everything, I found myself smiling slightly. "Shocking. The thing is," he continued, his tone growing serious, "while I can't excuse what I did with Vanessa, I've come to understand that my obsession with climbing higher was about proving my worth. To myself, to my parents, to everyone who ever looked down on the kid from the South Side who didn't belong in the executive suite. You always belonged," I said quietly. "You were brilliant at your job, Richard." That wasn't a lie. Maybe, he acknowledged. But I never felt it. There was always the next rung, the next title, the next validation. And when the ultimate prize seemed within reach, CEO of Axion, I was willing to sacrifice everything, including my integrity, including us. I closed my eyes, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions his voice still evoked. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know that what happened wasn't because I stopped loving you. It was because I was broken in ways I didn't understand." He paused. "And because I wanted to thank you for the recommendation letter. You had every right to destroy me professionally, but you didn't. Revenge has never interested me," I said. "Even at my angriest, I recognized that you're skilled at what you do." "That hasn't changed." We fell into silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, but weighted with shared history and hurt too complex to easily resolve. "How's Chicago?" I finally asked. "Colder than I remembered," he said wryly. "But good. It's simpler here. The company's smaller, the stakes lower. I'm learning to find satisfaction in the work itself, not just in climbing higher." "That sounds healthy." "It is," he agreed. "And you?" I saw the announcement about Axion's new AI platform. The stock's up 30% since you took over actively. It's been challenging but rewarding, I admitted. No more hiding, no more compartmentalizing. It's exhausting but also freeing. I'm glad, Richard said, and he sounded sincere. You were always meant for bigger things than you allowed yourself. Another silence stretched between us, this one tinged with the finality of separate paths. Well, Richard said eventually, I should let you go. I just wanted to clear the air. I appreciate that, I replied. Take care of yourself, Richard. You too, Sophia. Truly. After we hung up, I sat for a long time looking out at the bay, watching the light change as fog rolled in and receded, nature's own lesson in transformation and revelation. Richard's call had unexpectedly loosened something within me, a knot of anger and betrayal I hadn't realized I was still carrying. His apology hadn't erased the past, but it had somehow made it easier to set down. My phone buzzed with an email notification, the Axion board secretary confirming Monday's strategy meeting. I opened my laptop to review the agenda, thoughts already shifting to next week's challenges. The marriage was over. The deception was over. But the company, my company, now fully and openly mine, remained. And for the first time in years, I felt wholly present for whatever came next. 2 years after the divorce, Axion Technologies had undergone a remarkable transformation under my active leadership. We'd expanded our AI capabilities, acquired 3 strategic competitors, and doubled our market value. The business press that had once feasted on the scandal of my dual identity now featured me on their covers for professional achievements instead. I had settled into a new routine, demanding but fulfilling work, a small circle of genuine friends who knew the real me, occasional dates that rarely progressed beyond a second meeting. My life wasn't perfect, but it was authentic, which felt like its own kind of victory. On a rainy Tuesday evening, I was working late in my office when my assistant knocked on the door. Miss Blackwood, your 7 o'clock is here, she announced. I looked up, momentarily confused. I don't have a 7 o'clock. He says he has an appointment, my assistant replied diplomatically. A Mr. James Harrington from Quantum Dynamics. The name rang a bell. Quantum Dynamics was an emerging player in quantum computing, a field I'd been following with interest. But I definitely hadn't scheduled a meeting. Send him in, I said, curious enough to spare a few minutes. The man who entered was tall and silver-haired, with intelligent eyes behind rimless glasses, and an air of quiet confidence. Not conventionally handsome, but striking in his own way. Miss Blackwood, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for seeing me, especially since I suspect your assistant is correct that I'm not on your calendar. His directness was refreshing. You have me at a disadvantage, Mr. Harrington. James, please, he said, taking the seat I indicated across from my desk. And yes, I'm afraid I employed a small deception to get past your considerable gatekeepers. I've been trying to arrange a meeting through conventional channels for weeks without success. That's because my schedule is genuinely full, I replied, though without real annoyance. What was so urgent it required subterfuge? Not urgent, James said with a slight smile. Just important. I'm here to propose a partnership between Quantum Dynamics and Axion that I believe could revolutionize both our companies' futures. For the next 20 minutes, he outlined a surprisingly compelling vision for integrating quantum's computing architecture with Axion's AI platforms. It was technically sophisticated, strategically sound, and potentially transformative. Why bring this directly to me? I asked when he'd finished. Our business development team evaluates partnership proposals, because this isn't just a business proposal. James replied candidly. It's a moonshot that would require your personal investment and vision. Your team would evaluate it by conventional metrics and likely reject it as too speculative. I needed to speak to the person who transformed Blackwood Technologies into Axion, who sees possibilities others miss. I studied him with renewed interest. You've done your research thoroughly, he acknowledged. I find you fascinating, Miss Blackwood. Not for the tabloid version of your story, but for the business decisions you've made since taking active control of Axion. You've consistently looked beyond quarterly results to investments that might not pay off for years. That's the kind of thinking this partnership would require. There was something compelling about his straightforward approach, the absence of flattery or manipulation, just clear-eyed assessment and genuine enthusiasm for the work itself. Leave the proposal with me, I said, making a decision. I'll review it personally and give you an answer within the week. James smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. That's all I can ask for. Thank you for your time. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Would you consider discussing this further over dinner? The technical aspects are better explained in person than in the documents. The invitation caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because I found myself wanting to accept. Is this a business dinner or something else, Mr. Harrington? I asked directly. He considered the question seriously. Both, I think, he replied with refreshing honesty. I find your mind impressive and would genuinely value the technical discussion. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't also interested in getting to know you beyond your professional capabilities. His directness was disarming. After years of calculation and hidden agendas, including my own, the transparency was appealing. Dinner, then, I agreed. But I'll need to review the proposal first. Business before pleasure. I wouldn't have it any other way, James said with another smile. I look forward to your call. After he left, I sat for a long moment, turning the proposal over in my hands. It wasn't just the technical aspects that intrigued me, but the possibility they represented of something new, something built on transparency from the beginning. I opened the folder and began to read, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine curiosity about what might come next, not just professionally, but personally as well. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for once, I wasn't trying to control every variable or protect myself through deception. Whatever developed with quantum dynamics or with James Harrington would unfold with my full self present and accounted for. My father had taught me to keep my name off the letterhead to see people's true colors. In doing so, I'd hidden my own true colors for too long. Now, my name was exactly where it belonged, on the door, on the letterhead, and in every room where decisions were made. I had spent too many years being someone else's idea of who I should be. Never again. Epilogue. 5 years after the boardroom confrontation that changed everything, I stood on the balcony of a Napa Valley estate, watching sunset paint the vineyards gold. Below, staff moved efficiently through the garden, making final preparations for tomorrow's event, the official launch of Quantum Axion, the joint venture that had grown from that first unexpected meeting with James. There you are, came a voice behind me. James stepped onto the balcony, loosening his tie after a day of final press briefings. The team's wondering if you want to review the demonstration sequence one more time. It's perfect as it is, I said, smiling as he joined me at the railing. Let them enjoy the evening. Tomorrow will be chaotic enough, he nodded, placing a hand over mine on the railing. The platinum band on his ring finger caught the fading light, a match to the one I wore, both less than a year old. Nervous, he asked. About the launch? No, the technology works. The market is ready and we've done the preparation. I turned to face him. About having Richard there tomorrow? A little. James's expression remained neutral. He doesn't have to attend. The invitation was a courtesy given his role at Nexon. No, it's appropriate, I said firmly. Nexon is a potential client, and Richard is their CTO. This isn't personal anymore. James studied me for a moment, then nodded. If you're comfortable, then I'm comfortable. Just remember, if he makes a scene, I know at least 3 ways to discreetly escort him from the premises. I laughed, leaning into his solid presence. That won't be necessary. We've both moved on. The last time we spoke was civil, almost friendly. 3 years earlier, Richard had remarried a neurosurgeon with no connection to the tech world. From mutual acquaintances, I'd heard he seemed happy, more grounded. His career had rebounded, though along a different trajectory than he'd originally planned. As for me, I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for, a partnership based on mutual respect and complete honesty. James had known exactly who I was from the beginning, had pursued me with full awareness of my past and my power. There were no hidden identities, no secret agendas, just 2 people building something together, personally and professionally. Come inside, James said, pressing a kiss to my temple. The team wants to toast before everyone scatters for the night. I took one last look at the golden vineyards, thinking about paths taken and not taken, about the strange, painful journey that had led to this moment of contentment. Sophia, James prompted gently. Coming, I said, turning away from the view. Let's celebrate what we've built. Hand in hand, we walked inside to join the team, my name no longer a secret, my power no longer hidden, my life finally, completely my own. The morning of the quantum axion launch dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of this new venture. I stood before the full-length mirror in the master suite of the Napa estate, adjusting the collar of my navy blue dress, a power color for a power move. Today's launch wasn't just about a revolutionary technology partnership. It was the culmination of my journey from shadow owner to visible leader. You look formidable, James said, appearing behind me in the mirror as he fastened his cufflinks, a wedding gift from me, platinum with tiny quantum circuit etchings. That's the idea, I replied, with a smile. The tech press needs to focus on the product, not on whether the female CEO looks tired or overdressed. James came to stand beside me, resting his hand on my shoulders. At 6'2", he towered over my 5'6" frame, a physical presence that matched his intellectual one. They'll focus on the tech because it's extraordinary, he said confidently. And they'll focus on you because you're extraordinary. The woman who transformed not 1 but 2 companies while navigating the most public personal scandal in Silicon Valley history. I turned to face him, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his perfectly tailored jacket. Let's hope Richard's presence doesn't reignite interest in that particular chapter. Richard is a footnote, James said firmly. Today belongs to us, to quantum axion, and the future we're building. I nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. In the 3 years we'd been together, first as business partners, then as a couple, now as husband and wife, James had never once shown insecurity about my past or my professional stature. His confidence was not the brash ambition I'd seen in Richard, but something steadier, more rooted. Let's go make history, I said, reaching for his hand. The launch event was meticulously orchestrated, a demonstration of quantum axions breakthrough technology, followed by a reception for investors, press and potential clients in the vineyard's elegant event pavilion. 400 of the tech industry's most influential players were in attendance, with another 10,000 watching the live stream globally. I took the stage at precisely a.m., flanked by massive screens displaying the quantum axion logo, a stylized infinity symbol that merged the identities of both parent companies. "Good morning," I began, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. 7 years ago, quantum computing was a theoretical curiosity. 5 years ago, artificial intelligence was primarily focused on pattern recognition and prediction. Today we stand at the convergence of these two revolutionary technologies, a convergence that will fundamentally transform how we solve the world's most complex problems. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined Quantum Axion's vision using quantum-powered AI to tackle climate modeling, drug discovery, and materials science at scales previously unimaginable. I was followed by James, who guided the audience through the technical architecture with the clear, passionate explanations that had first drawn me to him in my office years before. The demonstration was flawless, our system solving in minutes a molecular modeling problem that would have taken traditional supercomputers months. The audience erupted in applause as the results appeared on screen, the implication of such computational power immediately evident to the technically savvy crowd. As James concluded his portion, I scanned the audience, unconsciously searching for one particular face. I found Richard in the third row, watching intently. He was thinner than I remembered, his dark hair now salted with gray at the temples. Beside him sat a woman I assumed was Caroline, his new wife, elegant, composed, with the focused expression of someone used to high-stakes environments. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement without emotion. I returned it before redirecting my attention to the presentation. The technical portion complete, we opened the floor for questions. Most were substantive, focusing on applications, scalability, and competitive differentiation. Then a tech reporter from the Wall Street Journal stood up. "Miss Blackwood, this is clearly a triumph for both you and Mr. Harrington. But I have to ask," he paused for effect, "does today's success feel particularly significant given your history with Nixon's CTO, Richard Martinez, who I note is in attendance today?" A subtle tension rippled through the room. 5 years had passed since the scandal, but the tech world's memory was long, and drama generated clicks. I maintained my composed expression, having anticipated this line of questioning. Today isn't about personal history. It's about technological innovation that will benefit humanity. Nexon is a potential client with impressive AI applications that could leverage our quantum architecture. Mr. Martinez's presence is purely professional, as is appropriate, James smoothly interjected. I'd add that Quantum Axion evaluates partnerships based on technical merit and strategic alignment. Personal histories don't factor into our business decisions. Now, who has a question about our actual technology? The moment passed, the reporter thwarted by our united front. The remaining questions returned to substantive topics, and by the time we concluded the formal presentation, the focus had firmly returned to the technology where it belonged. As the event transitioned to the networking reception, James squeezed my hand. "Handled perfectly," he murmured before being pulled away by an eager group of investors. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing potential applications with various industry leaders. It was during a brief moment alone, refreshing my water at the bar, but I heard a familiar voice behind me. Impressive work, Sophia. I turned to find Richard standing there, glass of sparkling water in hand. Up close, the years were more evident. On his face, fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a certain weathered quality that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Richard, I replied evenly. Let's hope Richard's presence doesn't reignite interest in that particular chapter. Richard is a footnote, James said firmly. Today belongs to us two quantum axion, and the future we're building. I nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. In the 3 years we'd been together, first as business partners, then as a couple, now as husband and wife, James had never once shown insecurity about my past or my professional stature. His confidence was not the brash ambition I'd seen in Richard, but something steadier, more rooted. Let's go make history, I said, reaching for his hand. The launch event was meticulously orchestrated, a demonstration of quantum axions, breakthrough technology, followed by a reception for investors, press and potential clients in the vineyard's elegant event pavilion. 400 of the tech industry's most influential players were in attendance, with another 10,000 watching the live stream globally. I took the stage at precisely AM, flanked by massive screens displaying the quantum axion logo, a stylized infinity symbol that merged the identities of both parent companies. Good morning, I began, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. 7 years ago, quantum computing was a theoretical curiosity. 5 years ago, artificial intelligence was primarily focused on pattern recognition and prediction. Today we stand at the convergence of these two revolutionary technologies, a convergence that will fundamentally transform how we solve the world's most complex problems. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined Quantum Axion's vision using quantum-powered AI to tackle climate modeling, drug discovery, and materials science at scales previously unimaginable. I was followed by James, who guided the audience through the technical architecture with the clear, passionate explanations that had first drawn me to him in my office years before. The demonstration was flawless, our system solving in minutes a molecular modeling problem that would have taken traditional supercomputers months. The audience erupted in applause as the results appeared on screen, the implications of such computational power immediately evident to the technically savvy crowd. As James concluded his portion, I scanned the audience, unconsciously searching for one particular face. I found Richard in the third row, watching intently. He was thinner than I remembered, his dark hair now salted with gray at the temples. Beside him sat a woman I assumed was Caroline, his new wife, elegant, composed, with the focused expression of someone used to high-stakes environments. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement without emotion. I returned it before redirecting my attention to the presentation. The technical portion complete, we opened the floor for questions. Most were substantive, focusing on applications, scalability, and competitive differentiation. Then a tech reporter from the Wall Street Journal stood up. Miss Blackwood, this is clearly a triumph for both you and Mr. Harrington. But I have to ask, he paused for effect, does today's success feel particularly significant given your history with Nixon's CTO, Richard Martinez, who I note is in attendance today? A subtle tension rippled through the room. 5 years had passed since the scandal, but the tech world's memory was long, and drama generated clicks. I maintained my composed expression, having anticipated this line of questioning. Today isn't about personal history. It's about technological innovation that will benefit humanity. Nexon is a potential client with impressive AI applications that could leverage our quantum architecture. Mr. Martinez's presence is purely professional, as is appropriate, James smoothly interjected. I'd add that Quantum Axion evaluates partnerships based on technical merit and strategic alignment. Personal histories don't factor into our business decisions. Now, who has a question about our actual technology? The moment passed, the reporter thwarted by our united front. The remaining questions returned to substantive topics, and by the time we concluded the formal presentation, the focus had firmly returned to the technology where it belonged. As the event transitioned to the networking reception, James squeezed my hand. Handled perfectly, he murmured before being pulled away by an eager group of investors. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing potential applications with various industry leaders. It was during a brief moment alone, refreshing my water at the bar, that I heard a familiar voice behind me. Impressive work, Sophia. I turned to find Richard standing there, glass of sparkling water in hand. Up close, the years were more evident. On his face, fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a certain weathered quality that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Richard, I replied evenly. And now we begin the next chapter, with no shadows from the past. I smiled, reaching for him. No shadows, no secrets, no divided selves. Just us and the future we're building. If only it had been that simple. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the launch. I was reviewing quarterly projections when my security chief, Diane Reeves, requested an urgent meeting. We've detected unusual activity targeting our systems, she reported once the door was closed. Sophisticated probes focused specifically on the quantum encryption protocols. I frowned. Industrial espionage? Possibly, Diane replied, though the attack vectors are unusually precise. Whoever it is knows exactly what they're looking for and where to find it. They're not fishing, they're hunting. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Quantum Axion's competitive advantage is our proprietary encryption. If that were compromised, the entire architecture would be vulnerable, Diane finished grimly. We've strengthened perimeter defenses and implemented additional authentication protocols, but I'm concerned these attacks show insider knowledge. You think we have a leak? Diane hesitated. I think someone with intimate understanding of our systems is providing guidance to external actors. The pattern suggests they know our defensive capabilities almost as well as we do. I sat back, mind racing through possibilities. Quantum Axion employed over 300 people, most with advanced technical knowledge. Any of them could potentially be compromised. I want a full security audit, I decided. Discreetly. Focus on anyone with access to the encryption protocols. And Diane, keep this between us for now. Not even James until we have more information. She nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. I'll begin immediately. After she left, I stared out the window at the San Francisco skyline, the bright afternoon suddenly feeling ominous. We'd anticipated competition, of course, even espionage attempts, standard hazards in the tech industry. But this felt targeted, personal somehow. Over the next 2 weeks, the attacks escalated in both frequency and sophistication. Our security team worked round the clock to repel them, but it was clear we were facing a determined and knowledgeable adversary. The breakthrough came at a.m. on a Tuesday. My phone rang, jolting me awake beside a still sleeping James. We've traced the attacks, Diane said without preamble when I answered. You need to see this immediately. 30 minutes later, I was in my office, staring at the evidence on the secure terminal. The attacks had been routed through a sophisticated maze of proxy servers and ghost networks, but Diane's team had meticulously unraveled the digital breadcrumbs. The origin point is Nexen Technologies, Diane said quietly. Specifically, their Advanced Research Division. The division Richard oversaw as CTO. Are you absolutely certain? I asked, though the evidence on screen was damning. Beyond reasonable doubt, she confirmed. The techniques match known Nexen signatures, and the timing aligns with their development cycle. They're trying to steal our quantum encryption to enhance their own neural network security. I sat in silence, absorbing the implications. After our civil interaction at the launch event, after his apparent personal growth and new life with Caroline, Richard was targeting my company. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was clear. What do you recommend? I asked Diane. Legally, we have grounds for a cease and desist, possibly a federal investigation given the nature of the technologies involved. However, she hesitated. However, a public legal battle would hurt Quantum Axion's reputation regardless of outcome. I finished for her. The mere suggestion that our encryption might be compromised would shake investor confidence. Precisely. I made a decision. Continue monitoring and strengthening defenses, but take no overt action yet. I need to handle this personally. After Diane left, I remained in my office as dawn broke over the city. The betrayal felt both shocking and somehow inevitable, as if some part of me had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Richard to reveal that his apparent redemption was just another mask. I didn't tell James immediately. I told myself it was because I needed more information, that I didn't want to burden him until I was certain of the best approach. But in truth, I feared his reaction, not anger at Richard, but disappointment in me for still being entangled in the past I claimed to have moved beyond. Instead, I arranged a private meeting with Richard, using a backdoor channel to avoid raising flags with his assistant or mine. 2 days later, we met at a small, discreet coffee shop in Palo Alto, neutral territory far from both our companies. He arrived punctually, dressed casually in jeans and a gray sweater. If he was surprised by my summons, he hid it well. "This is unexpected," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Problem with the potential collaboration?" I studied him carefully, looking for signs of guilt or deception. His expression revealed nothing beyond mild curiosity. "Let's dispense with the pretense, Richard," I said quietly. "I know about the cyberattacks originating from Nexen's Advanced Research Division." "Your division?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, not guilt, but calculation. "That's a serious accusation," he replied evenly. "One I assume you have evidence for." I slid a thumb drive across the table. "Everything we've documented. The attack patterns, the traced origins, the specific targeting of our quantum encryption protocols. It's comprehensive, Richard, and it would be devastating in court." He made no move to take the drive. "Why are we having this conversation privately instead of through legal channels, then?" "Because a public battle serves neither of us," I said frankly. "It would damage Quantum Axion's reputation for security and expose Nexen to federal investigation for corporate espionage. I'm offering you a chance to explain before things escalate irreversibly." Richard sat back, studying me with an intensity that was familiar from our marriage, the look he got when analyzing a complex problem. "I authorized defensive probing of your systems," he finally admitted. "Standard competitive intelligence within legal boundaries. But not the attacks you're describing. You expect me to believe that." "I expect you to verify it," he countered. "The evidence on that drive, have you examined it personally? Or are you relying on your security team's analysis?" The question gave me pause. "Diane Reeves is the best in the business." "She is," Richard agreed. which is why I find it hard to believe she'd miss something this obvious. Nexon would never launch direct attacks from our own servers. If your evidence points to us that clearly, someone wants you to think we're responsible. A seed of doubt took root. Richard was right, it was suspiciously straightforward for attacks of this sophistication. Who else would have both motive and the technical knowledge of our systems? I challenged. Richard leaned forward. That's the real question, isn't it? Who benefits if Quantum Axion and Nexon go to war with each other? Who knows enough about both companies' architectures to orchestrate this? The implication hung in the air between us. I shook my head. You're suggesting we're being manipulated by a third party? I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities before accelerating to mutual destruction, Richard replied. Let me take this evidence back to my security team. Give me 48 hours to investigate from our end. If we find we are responsible, even indirectly, I'll shut it down immediately and provide full disclosure of any compromised information. I considered his offer. Richard had lied to me before, betrayed me in the most personal way possible, and yet his argument had merit. The attacks were almost too perfectly traceable. 48 hours, I agreed. But if this is a delaying tactic, it isn't, he interrupted. Despite our history, I have no desire to destroy what you've built. Sapphire, contrary to what you might believe, I've genuinely moved on. I wanted to believe him. More importantly, I needed to know the truth, wherever it led. 48 hours? I repeated, rising from the table. Then I want answers. James noticed my preoccupation that evening as we prepared dinner in our Russian Hill apartment. Bored trouble? He asked, skillfully dicing vegetables while I stared absently at a glass of wine. I considered deflecting but decided against it. We had built our relationship on honesty. I wouldn't compromise that now. We have a security situation, I admitted. Sophisticated attacks targeting our encryption protocols. Diane traced them to Nexon. James's knife paused mid-chop. Richard's company. Yes. I met with him today. James set down the knife carefully, without discussing it with me first. It wasn't a question but a statement, his tone carefully neutral. I wanted to assess the situation before bringing it to the executive team, I explained. Richard claims Nexon isn't behind the attacks, that we're both being manipulated by a third party, and you believe him. The question was gentle but pointed. I don't know, I admitted. The evidence Diane found is compelling, but Richard raised valid concerns about how neatly it points to Nexon. He's investigating from his end. James was silent for a moment, resuming his methodical dicing. You've known Richard was at Nexon for years. Were you concerned about intellectual property risks when we developed the quantum encryption? The question caught me off guard. Of course we implemented standard competitive safeguards. But I never thought he'd directly target us, especially not after he seemed to have reformed. James finished. Sapphire, I've never questioned your judgment about Quantum Axion's security or leadership. But I need to ask, is it possible your history with Richard is clouding your perspective? In either direction? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself. It's possible, I acknowledged. Which is why I'd like you to independently review the evidence with Diane. Fresh eyes, no emotional baggage. James nodded, visibly relieved that I wasn't shutting him out. I'll meet with her first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, we should accelerate the security upgrades for the secondary protocols. If they're after the primary encryption, the secondaries could be next. We spent the evening developing contingency plans, our dinner forgotten as we worked side by side. The attacks and hardening our defenses. James met with Diane, while I handled a previously scheduled investor call, reconvening in my office afterward. Richard might be right, James said without preamble as he closed the door. The attack signatures are too clean, too easily traceable to Nexon. It's like finding a signed confession at a crime scene, suspicious in its convenience. So we're being played, I said, the confirmation of my growing suspicion settling like a weight. But by whom? And why? Diane's team is reanalyzing the evidence, looking for digital fingerprints that might have been obscured by the obvious Nexon connection. But we need to consider who has both the capability and motive. I pulled up a secure terminal, accessing Quantum Axion's competitive intelligence database. Direct competitors in the quantum space: Chimera Computing, Quantum Leap Technologies, Horizon Quantum. All would benefit from stealing our encryption or from seeing us distracted by conflict with Nexon. What about former employees? James suggested. Someone with insider knowledge who left under less than ideal circumstances. We compiled a list of potential threats: competitors, former employees, even nation-state actors interested in quantum technology. The possibilities were numerous, the evidence inconclusive. We need more information, I concluded. Let's continue hardening our defenses while Diane digs deeper. And we wait to hear what Richard finds on his end. The next 48 hours passed in tense anticipation. The attacks continued but were successfully repelled by our enhanced security measures. Diane's team made incremental progress, eliminating some suspects while identifying new attack vectors. Exactly 48 hours after our coffee shop meeting, Richard requested a secure video call. I took it in my private office, James standing supportively just out of camera range. Richard's face appeared on screen, his expression grave. We've completed our investigation, he said without preamble. The attacks did originate from Nexon servers, but they were executed through an elaborate system of compromised credentials and hidden backdoors. Someone wanted it to look like an official Nexon operation. Who? I demanded. Marcus Chen. The name hit like a physical blow. Marcus had been Axion's chief security officer before Diane, forced out during the leadership transition after my divorce from Richard. He'd landed at Nexon 6 months later, bringing with him intimate knowledge of Axion's security architecture. He has access to both companies' systems, I realized aloud. And motive against both of us: me for firing him, you for hiring him. Only to sideline him when you reorganized Nexon's security division last year. Richard nodded grimly. We've contained the situation on our end and revoked all his access. He's been terminated and escorted from the premises. The evidence has been turned over to federal authorities. Why target the quantum encryption specifically? I asked. That's where it gets complicated, Richard replied. Chen wasn't working alone. We found communications between him and Chimera Computing encrypted, but our team managed to crack enough to identify the connection. They were using him to sabotage both our companies while stealing intellectual property. James stepped into view beside me. Chimera is 3 months from launching their own quantum computing initiative. If they could obtain our encryption while simultaneously damaging our reputations through a public legal battle, they'd eliminate their 2 strongest competitors in one move, Richard finished. Elegant, if unethical. The 3 of us fell silent, absorbing the implications. Finally, I asked the question burning in my mind. Why come clean, Richard? You could have used this situation to your advantage. Richard's expression softened slightly. Despite what you might think of me, Sophia, I've learned some hard lessons about integrity. Caroline has. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She's helped me understand the difference between ambition and destructiveness. Between winning and scorching the earth, I studied his face, searching for deception but finding only weariness and what appeared to be genuine regret. So what? Now? I asked. Now we have a choice, Richard said. We can handle this publicly expose Chimera's industrial espionage and watch their stock implode days before their IPO. Or we can address it privately, strengthen our respective systems, and let them proceed unaware that we've discovered their plot. Letting them believe they've succeeded would give us a strategic advantage, James noted. They'd move forward with flawed intelligence while we prepare countermeasures. I considered our options. The vindictive part of me wanted to crush Chimera immediately, to make an example of them. But the strategist in me recognized the value of patience. We'll handle this quietly for now, I decided. Coordinate our security responses, close the vulnerabilities June exploited, and monitor Chimera's movements. When the time is right, when we have irrefutable evidence that can't be spun or denied, then we move publicly. Richard nodded in agreement. I'll have my team coordinate with Diane and Sophia. Thank you for bringing this to me directly instead of assuming the worst. The acknowledgement was unexpected. We both could have handled this differently, I admitted. After finalizing next steps and ending the call, I turned to James. I should have brought you in immediately, I said. I'm sorry. James was quiet for a moment, considering his response. You did what you thought was right based on the information you had. But yes, we're partners in every sense. That means facing these challenges together, especially when they involve your past, even when they involve Richard. I asked directly. Especially then, James replied. Because I need to know you trust me enough to help navigate those complicated waters. Your history with Richard is part of who you are. I've never asked you to pretend otherwise. But our future together can't be shadowed by secrets or unilateral decisions about mutual threats. He was right, of course. In trying to protect James from my complicated past with Richard, I'd fallen into old patterns of compartmentalization, the very behavior that had contributed to my marriage's downfall. It won't happen again, I promised, reaching for his hand. Complete transparency, even when it's difficult. Especially then, James squeezed my hand. That's all I ask. Now, let's go destroy Chimera computing together. The following months were intensely focused. Quantum Axion and Nexon established a secure back-channel for sharing intelligence about Chimera's activities while publicly maintaining our competitive positions. Our security teams, led by Diane and her Nexon counterpart, painstakingly documented every intrusion attempt, building an airtight case for when we eventually went public. Chimera proceeded with their IPO, raising billions on the promise of quantum technology suspiciously similar to our own. Their CEO, Victor Jean, made thinly veiled references to outdated approaches at Quantum Axion and Nexon in numerous interviews, positioning Chimera as the true innovator in the space. We let them talk. We let them build their house of stolen cards higher and higher, all while methodically preparing to collapse their foundation. 5 weeks after their IPO, with Chimera's stock at an all-time high, we struck. Not with a press release or legal filing, but with something far more devastating, a joint technical paper from Quantum Axion and Nexon demonstrating critical flaws in the encryption architecture Chimera had adopted, the very one they had stolen from us, but which we had deliberately compromised once we discovered Jun's espionage. The paper was peer-reviewed and irrefutable, published simultaneously with our announcement of a significantly advanced encryption protocol that rendered the stolen technology obsolete. Within hours, Chimera's stock plummeted 68%. Within days, their board had called for an independent investigation. Within weeks, federal authorities had issued subpoenas for Chen, Zhang, and Chimera's entire executive team. The technology press dubbed it the Quantum Con, running investigative pieces detailing Chimera's systematic corporate espionage. Industry analysts praised the unprecedented collaboration between traditional competitors Quantum Axion and Nexon to expose the fraud. What no one outside our inner circles knew was how this crisis had fundamentally altered my relationship with Richard, not rekindling anything romantic, but establishing something I hadn't thought possible. A respectful professional understanding based on shared experiences and hard-won wisdom. 6 months after the Chimera collapse, Richard and Caroline invited James and me to dinner at their home in Pacific Heights, not a business meeting, but a social evening. The initial awkwardness dissolved as the conversation flowed from industry gossip to Caroline's groundbreaking research to James's passion for traditional Japanese carpentry. As James and Caroline became engrossed in discussing applications of quantum processing to neurological imaging, Richard and I found ourselves alone on the terrace overlooking the bay. "I never properly apologized," Richard said quietly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Not for everything. We've both moved on," I replied, not entirely comfortable with reopening old wounds. "Yes, but closure matters," he insisted. "I betrayed you, Sophia, not just with Vanessa, but by trying to discard you professionally when it served my ambitions. Nothing justifies that, not even your deception about your identity." The directness of his acknowledgement caught me off guard. "Why now?" I asked. Richard looked out at the lights reflected on the water. "Because the Chimera situation made me realize something. When we worked together, really worked together, not against each other, we accomplished something neither of us could have done alone. It made me wonder how different things might have been if I'd known the truth from the beginning, if we'd been genuine partners professionally as well as personally." "We'll never know," I said, not unkindly. "No, but we can learn from it," Richard replied. "Caroline taught me that accountability isn't a single moment of apology, but an ongoing commitment to being better. So I'm telling you now, years too late, that I'm genuinely sorry for the pain I caused you." I studied him in the dim terrace light, seeing not the ambitious executive who had calculated his way through our marriage, nor the desperate man who had lashed out when exposed, but someone who had genuinely evolved. As had I. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'm sorry for not trusting you with the truth." "We both made choices that guaranteed failure," Richard nodded, accepting the shared responsibility. "And now we've both found partners who encourage our best selves rather than our worst tendencies." Through the glass doors, I could see James laughing at something Caroline had said, his expression animated as he described some concept with his hands. The sight filled me with quiet contentment. "Yes," I agreed. We rejoined our spouses, the conversation shifting to lighter topics for the remainder of the evening. As James and I rode home later, he asked the question I'd been expecting. "How was it?" The conversation with Richard. "Surprisingly healing," I admitted. He apologized genuinely, I think. And I realized I've been holding on to anger I didn't even know was still there. James nodded thoughtfully. "Closure is powerful. Does this mean regular double dates are in our future?" His teasing tone made me laugh. "Let's not get carried away. But perhaps a normalized relationship. Professional respect with occasional social interaction." "I can live with that," James said, taking my hand. "As long as you're happy." And I was truly happy. perhaps for the first time without shadows or reservations or compartmentalized selves. The company was thriving, my marriage was solid, and even my complicated history with Richard had found an unexpected resolution. I had spent the first half of my life hiding who I was, first at my father's insistence, then out of fear of not being loved for myself. The journey from Elena Martinez to Sophia Blackwood had been painful, but necessary. Now, finally, I was simply myself, my whole self in every aspect of my life. Epilogue. 10 years later, MOM. Uncle Richard and Aunt Caroline are here. My daughter's voice echoed through our Woodside home, interrupting my review of Quantum Axion's latest quarterly projections. At 12, Eliana was a whirlwind of energy and intelligence, with James's analytical mind and my determination. "Coming, sweetheart," I called back, closing my laptop and heading downstairs. Our annual summer barbecue had become something of a tradition, a gathering of family, close friends, and key colleagues in the relaxed setting of our home. James was already outside manning the grill, deep in conversation with our son Nicholas, who at 9 was experiencing his first serious interest in engineering. Richard and Caroline stood in the entryway, their 10-year-old twins darting past to find Eliana. The weight of my father's fountain pen felt unusually heavy in my hand as I signed the last of the quarterly reports. Outside my penthouse window, San Francisco's skyline glittered against the pre-dawn darkness, the city still sleeping, while I prepared for the most challenging performance of my life. In 3 hours, I would sit in a boardroom and watch my husband introduce his mistress as my replacement. Not as Sophia Blackwood, the woman who owned 62% of Axion Technologies, and who rarely graced the corporate headquarters with her presence, but as Elena Martinez, the chief marketing officer whose office was about to be handed to someone else. Someone sleeping with my husband. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 12 years, I'd been living a double life, wife to Richard Martinez and silent owner of the company where he'd built his career. 2 identities carefully kept separate until they were about to collide in the most painful way imaginable. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Left early for the office. Big day. See you there. No love you." No term of endearment. Just another business communication from the man whose body had been pressed against mine in sleep just hours ago. I closed a portfolio containing the documents that would destroy my marriage and possibly my company. Either way, after today, nothing would ever be the same. I remember the day I inherited Blackwood Technologies with perfect clarity. I was 26, standing in my father's study as rain lashed against the windows, the San Francisco fog so thick it seemed to seep through the glass. My father's attorney, Mr. Winters, looked uncomfortable as he slid the documents across the polished mahogany desk. "Your father's instructions were very specific, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The entirety of Blackwood Technologies transfers to you with the provision that your role as majority shareholder remains confidential." I stared at the papers, my grief momentarily eclipsed by confusion. He wanted me to run his company in secret. Why? Mr. Winters adjusted his glasses. "Your father believed that anonymity would be your greatest protection. In his words, the moment they know who you are, they'll never show you who they really are." I could almost hear my father's voice, that slight Romanian accent he never lost despite 40 years in America, the way he emphasized certain words when imparting what he considered essential wisdom. A self-made immigrant who built a tech empire through equal parts brilliance and brutal pragmatism, Nikolai Blackwood had always been paranoid about people's intentions. With good reason, as it turned out. My mother had left when I was 3, more interested in my father's growing fortune than in raising a child. His second wife, with whom he'd been in divorce proceedings when his heart gave out, had been caught trying to transfer company assets to offshore accounts. So I'm supposed to hide in the shadows? Let others run my inheritance? I asked, my voice rising with incredulity. Not at all, Mr. Winters replied, reaching for another folder. Your father created an elaborate structure. You'll have full control, but through proxies and shell companies. You'll attend board meetings as Sophia Blackwood, major investor, when necessary. Day-to-day operations will continue under the current CEO, with you as the unseen authority. Your father called it the perfect vantage point. You'll see everything while no one sees you. I signed the papers that day, still numb with grief and overwhelmed by responsibility. At 26, with a master's in business from Stanford and 3 years working in venture capital, I was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in tech, and no one could know. For the first year, I followed my father's plan precisely. I observed, learned, and quietly guided Blackwood Technologies, soon rebranded as Axion, through proxies and carefully placed allies. I maintained my separate identity as Sophia Blackwood, venture capitalist and philanthropist, a woman of means, but not the billionaire I actually was. It was at the Marino Foundation Gala where my carefully separated worlds first threatened to collide. The Marino Foundation's annual fundraiser was San Francisco's premier charity event, a gathering of tech moguls, old money and social climbers, all writing large checks for medical research while networking over champagne and overdressed canapés. I attended every year, both as a genuine supporter of their pediatric cancer research and as a way to keep tabs on the tech industry's social hierarchy. That particular April evening, I was standing near the bar in a black Givenchy gown, half listening to a drone startup founder's pitch while scanning the room for a graceful exit. He's been cornering everyone with funding potential for the past hour, said a voice behind me. His technology is promising, but his business model has more holes than Swiss cheese. I turned to find a tall man with dark eyes and an amused expression, offering me a fresh glass of champagne. His tuxedo was well cut, but not bespoke, his watch nice but not ostentatious, someone successful but not extraordinarily wealthy. And you know this because? I asked, accepting the champagne and using it as an excuse to step away from the drone enthusiast, who had already located his next victim. Because I've sat through his entire pitch twice now, and I've run the numbers, the man said, extending his hand. Richard Martinez, Director of Strategic Partnerships at Axion Technologies. My pulse quickened at the mention of my company. I'd seen his name in reports, of course, a rising mid-level executive with impressive networking skills and a talent for landing partnerships with larger tech firms. His personnel file noted his ambition and occasional tendency to overstep. But his results were undeniable. Sophia Blackwood, I replied, shaking his hand and watching carefully for any sign of recognition. There was none. Just an appreciative smile and a slight heightening of interest at my last name, common enough in Silicon Valley circles, but not directly connected to Axion in public knowledge. Blackwood, of Blackwood Ventures? He asked. A convenient assumption. I'd established a small but respectable venture fund under my own name, partly as cover and partly to satisfy my genuine interest in emerging technologies. Guilty, I said with a smile. And you're with Axion? I've heard good things. We're having a strong year, Richard said with confidence that bordered on but didn't quite cross into arrogance. though I am sure you've got better investment opportunities crossing your desk every day than anything I could pitch you. Depends on the pitch, I replied, surprised to find myself enjoying the banter. For the next hour, we talked about industry trends, the posturing endemic to these events, and eventually our backgrounds. Richard was from Chicago, the son of a high school teacher and a nurse who'd worked his way through Northwestern and built his career step by methodical step. No shortcuts, no family connections. I found it refreshing. By the end of the evening, I'd given him my personal phone number, something I rarely did, especially with someone from Axion. It was a risk, but one I rationalized as keeping closer tabs on mid-level sentiment at my company. That was the first of many lies I told myself about Richard Martinez. Our courtship was a whirlwind by my standards. Richard was charming, attentive, and refreshingly straightforward after years of navigating the calculated social maneuvers of tech's elite circles. He was ambitious, but seemingly genuine, with a Midwestern directness I found disarming. On our third date, at a small Italian restaurant in North Beach, he confessed his 5-year plan to reach C-suite level at Axion, then eventually step out to found his own company. I know Axion's ceiling, he said, twirling pasta around his fork. The old Blackwood leadership structure is still too entrenched. The founder's daughter owns most of it, from what I hear, but she's just a signature on quarterly reports. The real power is with the board and the executive team, the people who've been there for decades. I took a long sip of wine to hide my reaction. This was exactly why my father had insisted on my anonymity, to hear these unfiltered perspectives. And you don't see yourself breaking into that circle? I asked carefully. Richard's expression hardened momentarily. I'm an outsider. No Stanford degree, no family connections. I've made it this far on results, but there's a certain level where results aren't enough anymore. You need to be part of the club. There was an edge to his voice that gave me pause, a glimpse of something beneath the polished exterior. But then he smiled, the moment passing as he reached for my hand across the table. But enough about corporate politics, he said. I'd much rather hear about your latest investment ventures. I shared sanitized versions of my actual work ventures I was considering, trends I found promising. Richard listened attentively, asking insightful questions that demonstrated genuine interest or very skillful pretense. After dinner, walking along the Embarcadero with the Bay Bridge illuminated against the night sky, Richard stopped and turned to me. I'm typically much more strategic about my life, he said, his expression surprisingly vulnerable. I analyze, plan, calculate risks. But with you, I find myself being impulsive. When he kissed me, the warm night air carrying the scent of salt water and his cologne, I made my own impulsive decision to let myself fall for someone who had no idea who I really was. 6 months into our relationship, Richard was promoted to Vice President of Business Development at Axion. I knew about it before he did, having signed off on the recommendation from 3 levels of management, but I feigned delighted surprise when he called with the news. This calls for a proper celebration, I told him. My treat. I took him to Gary Danko, where I'd reserved a private dining area. After a dinner that cost more than his new raise and several glasses of exceptional wine, I presented him with a Mont Blanc pen I'd had engraved with his initials. To the first of many promotions, I said, raising my glass. Richard studied the pen, running his thumb over the engraving. It's beautiful. Too beautiful for signing mundane corporate paperwork. Save it for the important signatures, Then I suggested, like when you sign the lease for your own company someday, or other significant life documents. His eyes met mine, something unreadable flickering in their depths. Significant life documents, he repeated softly. 3 months later, he used that pen to sign our marriage license, after proposing on Baker Beach with a diamond ring that I knew represented a significant portion of his savings. The ethical complications of my position weren't lost on me. I had approved his promotion. I would approve all his future promotions. There were moments I almost told him everything when we were house hunting, and I had to pretend to care about mortgage rates I could have paid 100 times over. Or when he proudly showed me the investment portfolio he'd built that was a fraction of what I controlled. But each time, I hesitated. What we had felt real precisely because he didn't know. With Richard, I was just Elena, a woman with a modest trust fund from her immigrant father, ambitious but not extraordinarily wealthy or powerful. He loved me, not my company or my fortune. The longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine confessing my deception. So I constructed an elaborate compartmentalization. In public and in our home, I was Elena Martinez, taking his name and his identity. For Axion Business, I remained Sophia Blackwood during the quarterly board meetings I occasionally attended in person, where Richard wasn't present. I maintained separate phones, email accounts, even subtle alterations to my appearance, different makeup styles, hair configurations, and clothing choices for each identity. It was exhausting, complicated, and entirely unsustainable, but I convinced myself it was temporary. I would tell him the truth when the time was right, when I was certain our foundation was uncheckable. Another lie I told myself. 5 years into our marriage, Richard's career at Axion had flourished. He'd risen to Senior Vice President of Global Strategy, reporting directly to the CEO. His ambition hadn't waned, but his 5-year plan to leave and start his own company had evolved into a longer-term goal of reaching the very top of Axion itself. Our personal life, meanwhile, had settled into comfortable patterns. We'd purchased a beautiful home in Pacific Heights. I'd insisted on paying my half through elaborate financial machinations that funneled my actual money through enough channels to appear as legitimate income from my venture fund. We traveled extensively, maintained an active social life with carefully selected friends, none who knew me as Sophia, and enjoyed the rhythms of our dual-career household. The only significant tension was Richard's increased focus on legacy and my reluctance to start a family. I had legitimate concerns pregnancy and motherhood would make maintaining my dual identities nearly impossible, and I still hadn't resolved how to merge my divided life. "We're not getting any younger, Elena," Richard said during a rare weekend at home, both of us catching up on work while sharing the couch. "I'm about to turn 40. You're 35. If we want children, we need to start thinking seriously about timing." I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing Axion's quarterly projections, the same ones he had presented to the board, where I was absent, represented by proxy the previous day. "I'm not saying never," I replied carefully. "Just not yet. I finally got the partners at Thomson and Reed taking me seriously. Having a baby now would derail everything I've worked for." Richard's expression darkened. "And if I said my career was finally at a point where I could take paternity leave without consequences? That the timing is perfect from my perspective. Is it?" I challenged gently. "You've been talking about the CEO position opening up in the next few years. Bradley's retirement is coming, and you've made it clear you want to be considered. Is this really the ideal moment for diaper changes and sleepless nights?" He fell silent, his ambition temporarily checkmating his desire for children. It was manipulative of me, using his career aspirations against him. But I needed time I was running out of. What I couldn't tell him was that I already had the perfect solution in mind. As Sophia Blackwood, I had been quietly engineering CEO Bradley's early retirement package for months. My plan was to support Richard's candidacy for the position through my proxy board votes and influence. Once he achieved his ultimate career goal, becoming CEO of Axion, I would finally reveal myself as the company's owner. Our professional and personal lives would merge, and we could start a family without the exhausting charade. At least, that was the plan until Richard came home one evening with an unexpected proposal. "What would you think about coming to work at Axion?" he asked over dinner, watching me carefully. I nearly choked on my wine. "What, in the marketing department?" he continued. "Janet Lowell is retiring as CMO at the end of the quarter. You've got the perfect background. Your venture experience gives you insight into market positioning. You understand tech without being too deep in the engineering weeds, and you've always had brilliant instincts about consumer behavior. But I'd be working at your company under you, essentially," I said, mind racing through the potential complications. Richard shook his head. "Not directly. You'd report to Bradley, same as I do. We'd be peers on the org chart." He reached for my hand across the table. "Think about it. We could commute together, have lunch sometimes, actually understand the day-to-day stresses of each other's work lives. Wouldn't it be nepotism?" I asked, grasping for reasonable objections. "The SVP's wife being hired as an executive. You'd go through the proper interview process with the board and executive team," Richard assured me. "Use your maiden name if you're concerned about appearances. Elena Martinez is qualified on her own merits. Your awesome speaks for itself." The idea was absurd, dangerous, and yet strangely tempting. A part of me had always regretted not taking a more direct role in running Axion. My father had built the company with his own hands and mind. I had merely preserved and grown it from a distance. And working alongside Richard, seeing that part of his life up close instead of through reports and meeting minutes. "Let me think about it," I said, buying time to consider all the angles. Later that night, I lay awake beside Richard's sleeping form, contemplating the riskiest performance of my double life. If I took the CMO position, I would essentially be working for myself without anyone knowing. I would have to maintain perfect separation between Elena Martinez, marketing executive, and Sophia Blackwood, owner, even as I sat in meetings making decisions that I could override in my other identity. It was madness. It would require constant vigilance, perfect record keeping, and an even more elaborate system of separate phones, emails, and schedules. But it would also give me direct insight into Axion's operations beyond the filtered information that reached me as the absent owner. And it would allow me to work closely with Richard to better understand the man I'd married, the man who still didn't fully know his wife after 5 years of marriage. Against all better judgment, I decided to do it. Elena Martinez would apply for the CMO position at Axion Technologies, interviewed by a board that had no idea they were meeting with the woman who could fire them all with a single phone call. It was the beginning of the end, though I couldn't have known it then. The interview process was surreal.